very much, Speaker. I too want to speak about this omnibus bill, just to give you a bit of an idea why we call it that. First of all, Speaker, it was a bit of a surprise to see this finance bill. You'll see as I go through my 20 minutes where we reveal the real reason why this bill is here. But just to read some of the schedule, Speaker, will give you an idea just how wide-reaching and varied and unrelated these topics are. This deals with the Assessment Act, City of Toronto Act, Electricity Act, government advertising, which of course we've heard from the Auditor General how terrible this has turned out, forfeited property, liquor control, labour relations, OLG, pension benefit, Trillium Trust, tobacco, taxation, the list goes on and on and on. 23 unrelated schedules, Speaker. That's why we call it an omnibus bill. It's packaged together, but when I'm through my 20 minutes, I think the people of Ontario will have a pretty good idea of what this entire bill is all about. All 167 pages of it are really to overshadow one sentence on page 162, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So, Speaker, I'm going to talk about burning the furniture to heat the house. We've heard that expression before. It's the title of my newest newsletter, the Fedeli Focus on Finance. Minister, I know you're going to enjoy it. If you've read previous editions of Focus on Finance, then you would be well aware that we've been warning that the government's aim with selling off Hydro One and other assets was never, ever to pay for transit and infrastructure, as they continue to suggest, but rather to make their massive deficit look smaller. The Fall Economic Statement, introduced 11 days late, according to the province's own fiscal accountability legislation, it provided proof, irrefutable proof, that the government is doing exactly that. Speaker, they are taking the revenue from asset sales to make up for their ineptness and mismanagement of the finances of the province of Ontario, which, despite where the minister says we've recovered from recession, we still have a massive deficit. They say it's $7.5 billion. We show it's $9.5 billion. Their own documents show it's actually $9.5 billion. So we haven't recovered from recession. We're the province, the former engine of Confederation. We're now the province who is a have-not province, and we're the province who still has our hand out looking for money from the federal government because we have mismanaged here. The Liberals have mismanaged the finances of the people of Ontario. So, Speaker, the government is claiming they'll reduce the deficit in 2015-16 from $8.5 billion to $7.5 billion, but they only achieve this number by booking the proceeds from the sale of Hydro One as revenue. And this is proved by the quote on page 100 of their own Fall Economic Statement, which reads, quote, "This increase in revenue largely reflects the government's progress on its asset optimization strategy." That's the nice way of selling we sold off Hydro One, related to the recent Hydro One IPO. On page 101, the government breaks down the $1.25 billion in revenue. They have $155 million coming from traditional taxes and $1.09 billion coming from the sale of Hydro One. That's in their own document. They booked the sale of Hydro One as revenue, which artificially lowers the deficit, because tomorrow when they take it out, now we have a $9.5 billion deficit and one heck of a hole in their budget. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to expose the clear and deliberate plan the government implemented to facilitate the sale of Hydro One and put that revenue towards reducing the debt. Speaker, it was a long and convoluted plan that was implemented over a full year, all to achieve that one goal. I'm going to talk about how we tie in the government's 2015 budget their surprise finance bill 144, which we're talking about today, and their fall economic statement. All of those three pieces come together to tell us why there's one sentence in this that we need to pay attention. The whole book was written for that one sentence. It started with the Premier standing under that massive banner that read in big capital letters, and she was dwarfed by this banner. It was so large. Beer in grocery stores. And there's where she stood to announce the sale of Hydro One, of course. Days after the 2015 budget, we received a binder with 45 schedules, and it was there that we learned that all oversight for Hydro One was going to be eliminated. No further access to freedom of information, Auditor General, Financial Accountability Officer, and several other officers, the Ombudsman, and so on. This was designed to make it virtually impossible for anyone to get accurate information on the details of the Hydro One sale. So that's how it starts. Now, the first piece of the puzzle was the development of the Trillium Trust. In 2014 budget, the government established the trust ostensibly to hold the funds from the sale of assets. But the bill actually states they may put a portion of the proceeds into the trust. Now, we tried here to close that loophole to make them put all of the proceeds must be put in the trust, but the Liberal government voted against those amendments because we know what their agenda is now. We suspected it back then, but now we know what it is. This was the first step necessary in putting the asset proceeds straight into revenue, never into infrastructure as claimed. The next piece is exposed. When you compare the 2014 and the 2015 budgets, both budgets announced that the $130 billion infrastructure expenditure. But in the 2014 version, the original version, only $3.1 billion over 4 years was necessary from asset sales. And that includes $1.1 billion from the sale of the GM shares. That was year one. Then $1 billion in the next year, $1 billion in the year after, and $500 million the following year. So we know, I'm sorry, it was $1 billion and then $500 million and $500 million. That's the $3.1 billion. No mention of Hydro One. The Hydro One money was not necessary to make the $130 billion infrastructure plan. But then the 2015 budget came along and it painted a different picture. It had the exact same $130 billion, the same expenditures, except now all of a sudden it needed the Hydro One money somehow to make it fly. Well, we know it was not necessary. The original $130 billion budget already had the expenditures accounted for, and the revenue accounted for. So now we know that this money really was excess, extra money, and now, of course, it was the most obvious indicator of the government's true intentions. They would, in essence, put the proceeds of the sale of Hydro One into transit, but take the already budgeted money for transit out and use that, in a nice way, I would say, to lower the deficit. If I really wanted to say what I meant, it would be to make up for their incompetence, their ineptness, and their mismanagement of money over the last several years. So that brings us to the final piece required, and that's swapping out the money. Here's where this bill comes in. One day, absolutely without notice, this government puts forward Bill 144. It's a 167-page finance bill. It has all kinds of issues that I mentioned earlier, horse racing, where they eliminate the Ontario Racing Commission after its long and storied history. They're into tobacco, the Toronto Act, all of these other things. But really, it was all about this one sentence that was buried on page 162. It's Schedule 22, Section 7, item number 1. And it says, it's all about authorizing expenditures of the proceeds of the asset sales, and it says, it reads, to reimburse the Crown for expenditures relating to the construction or acquisition of infrastructure. You know, that's where you go, aha, all along we've known and we've said it for more than a year now, that that entire sale was nothing more than a facade to facilitate the lowering of the deficit, and I've said earlier, basically to mask the incompetence, the ineptness, and the mismanagement of taxpayer funds over the last decade. So that single sentence, Speaker, to reimburse the Crown, that single sentence is why this entire bill was created. There's no other reason. It's buried on page 162. One sentence, one word, reimbursed. That's what it's all about, Speaker. There's nothing. There's almost nothing more to add. They've been outed. They've been exposed. We now know the combination of the fall economic statement, their budget bill, and the 2015 budget. They paint the picture. We now know what it's all about. But everybody knows also, Speaker, this doesn't balance the budget. It just falsely inflates the revenue. That's all it's doing, Speaker. And that's why we say it's burning the furniture to heat the home. It doesn't tackle their core problem. It doesn't tackle the systemic operating deficit that they have created, Speaker, and what happens when you run out of things to sell. So we know what's next. There'll be the LCBO warehouse, the OPG tower across the street. There'll be the Lakelands property, the other properties. Eventually, we're going to run out of things to sell, but we still have the spending that they haven't tackled. And that's where we're going to have this $8 billion hole in the budget that the Financial Accountability Officer revealed to all people interested in Ontario. So before the fall economic statement, the Financial Accountability Officer came out with his fiscal outlook for Ontario. And he concludes that there's a substantial risk that Ontario will not balance the province's books by 2017-18. In fact, he stated that if the current revenue and spending patterns continue, we can expect that year's deficit to reach $3.5 billion, not to balance. And if spending grows to 3%, he expects the deficit to hit $7.4 billion. Either way, it's not a balance. So here's a quote, Speaker, from the Waterloo Record, their editorial of November 28th. So overly optimistic were Finance Minister Charles Sousa's predictions this week in his fall economic statement, they belonged at Canada's Wonderland, not Queen's Park. They're products of some fantasy world, a kingdom of plastic mountains and mechanical unicorns where every wish, however ridiculous, comes true for a while. The trouble is, when you leave, you're back in the real world. Well, welcome back to the real world. That's where we are today, Speaker. Never mind the unicorns and the fantasy. The number one concern of the Financial Accountability Officer was that the government had overestimated their revenue projections, thereby making it nearly impossible to balance the budget by 2017-18. So the FAO actually estimated the gross domestic product to only grow by 3%, instead of the 2015 budget projection of 4.3%. The government's own fall economic statement confirmed the FAO's suspicion. Page 95, the government reveals that GDP will only grow by 2.9%, right in line with the FAO. But here's where the problem is. The FAO said it shouldn't be 4.3, it should be 3%, and that's going to reduce your revenue. Well, they did lower it, in fact, better than 3 to 2.9%, but then they actually increased the revenue. So instead of falling from 124 billion to 123, they actually fluffed it up to 125.6 billion. Somehow, with less revenue, you get more revenue. I'm not sure how that works. The Financial Accountability Office certainly doesn't understand how that works. But the FAO has always said that the budget was overstating revenue projections for each year. He encouraged the government to adjust the revenue projection to reflect the lack of future revenue. Again, instead of following the advice of the Financial Accountability Officer, the fall economic statement again has revenue drastically increasing instead of decreasing. The officer also stated that everything would have to go perfectly for the Liberals to achieve that balanced budget. But when you read the adjusted forecast for this year, it's the first indication that all is not perfect. We're still in this fantasy land. So we see the $8 billion hole in the budget that the FAO office has given us. We have a difference of $2.2 billion this year, $2.1 billion next year, and of course the year that they're to balance, we have a $3.7 billion hole, which is an $8 billion hole in the budget. This is from our financial accountability officer, somebody who we respect on this side of the House, Speaker, and whose numbers we actually do believe and actually do listen to. So the government has to have several scenarios. They can use $8 billion of Hydro One proceeds to plug that revenue hole and balance the budget, artificially balance the budget. They can use the proceeds from Hydro One to spend on infrastructure, as they claim, although we know that's not where it's going, and leave an $8 billion revenue gap. They can use the Hydro One proceeds to spend on infrastructure and raise some infrastructure and raise taxes to fill the balance, or they can do a combination of all of those above, Speaker. But in essence, the government is going to have to break one or more of their promises, either the infrastructure spending or balance the budget, in order to fill the other. Or, as we all suspect, and we've seen historically, they will simply raise taxes. That's where we know that this government is most comfortable. While the finance minister continues to insist in this legislature that government is controlling spending, the fall economic statement, of course, reveals 19 ministries are projected to spend more than the previous fiscal year. So, Speaker, when we look at all of that, and then we jump to page 106 of the fall economic statement, and we see what they're talking about with cap and trade. That's the next one. It's going to leave us, Speaker, cap in hand, and here's why. The Hydro One shell game isn't enough. It's not the only accounting trick the government is going to rely on to artificially present a balanced deficit. They, on page 106, revealed they intend to use the proceeds from this cap and trade scheme to balance the budget. I'll quote, "The document also reveals," this is a story from the National Post, November 27. "The document also reveals for the first time how much money the government hopes to raise from a new cap and trade scheme that will be phased in. It expects to raise," and I'll quote from page 106, Speaker, $300 million next year and $1.3 billion from the year after. That's the quote from their own, the Liberal government's fall economic statement, page 106. They will take $1.3 billion from the cap and trade and use that to pay for the mistakes that they've made in the past, their mismanagement, their ineptness, and the hurt that they've caused to the people of Ontario. They will mask with this $1.3 billion tax. Speaker, there's also the minister, when he was here earlier, said, in his earlier speech, the plan is working. The plan is working. So let me tell you, the economic statement has quietly reduced their expectations of job creation and growth. Despite their continuing bravado from the minister and rhetoric to the contrary, let's look at their own fall economic statement. He tells us that their plan is working, but in the 2015 budget, they had 78,000 new jobs. In the fall economic statement, their new document, they've lowered it to 46,000, Speaker, down their own projections show us being down 32,000 jobs from just a few months ago when the budget came out. They also have a projection for employment to be down by 15,000 the year after and more the following year as well. The minister said that we've recovered from the global recession, but, Speaker, again, they showed a $9.5 billion deficit in the last fall economic statement before their shell game, up from the $8.5 billion that they projected. Speaker, this tells us that the real direction of the deficit, if it wasn't for using the one-time sale of the hydro revenue to artificially support, what do you do next year? Well, you've got some more sales. What do you do the year after? Some more sales. You have not fixed the systemic problem that we have. So when the minister continues to talk about all these good things, let's just look at some other things that keep the rest of the people of Ontario up at night. Our debt to GDP is now over 40%. When the Liberal government took office, we were at a respectable 27%. Today, 40%. The debt per person in Ontario, $21,000. Interest on debt will rise to nearly $13 billion by 2017-18. That will be almost 10% of the total government spending, Speaker. And contrary to the government's claims, the fall economic statement shows federal transfer payments were actually up. Speaker, everything that we present here are the facts from either the Financial Accountability Office or their own fall economic statement, yet we hear them day after day, week after week, month after month, standing here telling us a completely different story. I urge the government to read their own documents for a change, to listen to the Financial Accountability Office, and to stop the mismanagement of the funds of the people of Ontario. And I thank you very much for allowing me this opportunity to expose the real truth behind page 162, the one sentence of this whole book was intended to shield. Thank you.
Further debate?